Pull up a chair and dim the light. Leave your worries at the door tonight. No need to whisper, no need to hide. We're all chasing shadows side by side. Southern moon and candle flame. Every ghost has another name. Haunted halls and forgotten dreams. Nothing's ever quite what it seems. Old photographs and dusty frames. Everybody's got stories they can't explain. Somewhere in the quiet between heartbeats, wonder waits for those who see. Did you hear it? Did you see? Tell me what you believe. Was it fate? Was it fear? Or something drawing you near? Curiosity after dark, where we wander through the strange. Every question leaves a mark. Nothing ever stays the same. Ghost stories under midnight skies. Old legends pass through lullabies. Take my hand and lose the fear. Wonder's always welcome here. Curiosity after dark, where restless hearts belong. Searching shadows for a spark, finding wonder in the unknown. Haunted mansions dressed in lace. Footsteps echo through empty space. Vampire myths and whispered lore. 100 secrets behind one door. Disney ghosts and phantom brides. Truth and fiction intertwined. The things we fear, the things we seek, have a funny way of making us believe. True crime headlines and unsolved names. The monsters hiding in familiar frames. The world is stranger than we know, and that's exactly why we go. Stories pass from friend to friend. Questions without easy ends. Somewhere between doubt and faith, we keep searching anyway. Tell me your stories, tell me your fears. Tell me the things you've carried for years. What's in the darkness? What have you seen? Tell me what keeps you wondering. Curiosity after dark, where we wander through the strange. Every question leaves a mark. Nothing ever stays the same. Ghost stories under midnight skies. Old legends pass through lullabies. Take my hand and lose the fear. Wonder's always welcome here. Curiosity after dark, where restless hearts belong. Searching shadows for a spark, finding wonder in the unknown. Maybe monsters wear familiar faces. Maybe angels leave no traces. Maybe every legend starts with someone asking, what if? Maybe myths and memories pass through generations quietly. Maybe truth is stranger still, waiting just beyond the hill. Maybe the things that keep us awake are the questions we were born to chase. Maybe wonder never dies, it just opens different eyes. So tell me what haunts you. Tell me what fascinates you. Tell me the stories you swore were true. Tell me what made you look twice. We'll talk about ghosts and graveyards, about creatures hidden in folklore, about the darkness in humanity and the beauty of not knowing. No judgment here, no need to convince anyone. You don't have to have the answers, just curiosity. Curiosity after dark, where we wander through the strange. Every question leaves a mark. Nothing ever stays the same. Ghost stories under midnight skies. The legends pass through lullabies. listening tonight, you're exactly where you ought to be. Beneath the moon and among the stars, there's room here for mystery. Keep asking questions, keep chasing wonder, keep looking closer, even when the answers never come. And if something goes bump in the night, maybe it's just another story waiting to be told. Welcome to Curiosity After Dark.
Okay, there we go. Alright, so what the hell now? Alright, so I'm just gonna do that. Actually, you know what? Alright, so good evening, everyone, and thankfully the audio is working now. Thank you, P-Money. Welcome back to Curiosity After Dark, the show where we explore the stories that history left behind and the mysteries that still refuse to disappear. Tonight, we're stepping into one of the most famous crime scenes in American history. It's a story that nearly everyone thinks they know. Most of us grew up hearing the same nursery rhyme: Lizzie Borden took an axe. It's been repeated for generations. It's appeared in books, movies, TV shows, podcasts, and documentaries. But here's something that might surprise you. Almost every line of that rhyme is historically inaccurate. Investigators never proved Lizzie used an axe. Her father wasn't struck 40 times. Her stepmother wasn't struck 41 times. And even the order described in the rhyme doesn't match what investigators concluded happened inside the home. And yet the rhyme became more famous than the facts. On the morning of August 4th, 1892, two people were murdered inside their home in Fall River, Massachusetts. Andrew Borden, one of the city's wealthiest businessmen, and his wife Abby were killed in an attack so violent that it shocked the nation. Newspapers from New York to California covered the story almost daily. Crowds gathered outside the Borden home hoping to catch a glimpse of the investigation. Before long, one quiet New England city had become the center of one of America's first true media sensations. At the center of it all was Andrew's youngest daughter, Lizzie. She was 32 years old. She attended church. She worked with charitable organizations. She came from a respected family. To many people, she didn't fit the image of a murderer at all. But detectives believed that the killer had never truly left the house. What followed was one of the most controversial murder investigations of the 19th century. A case built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence, conflicting witness statements, and questions that never been answered to anyone's satisfaction. Even today, more than 130 years later, historians still debate what happened inside that house. Was Lizzie guilty? Was somebody else responsible? Did investigators overlook crucial evidence? Or is the truth simply lost to history? And that's only half of tonight's story. The Borden house still stands in Fall River. Today, it operates as both a museum and an inn where guests can spend the night in the very rooms where the murders occurred. Over the years, visitors, employees, and paranormal investigators have reported footprints in empty hallways or footsteps in empty hallways, unexplained voices, doors moving on their own, shadowy figures, and encounters they believe are connected to the events of that August morning. Now, this episode is going to be a little different, but we are going to do the classic Curiosity After Dark way. We're going to separate documented history from the legend. When something comes from court records, newspaper accounts, and historical research, I'll tell you exactly what that is. When we move to the paranormal section, I'll make it clear what's been reported and wasn't, and what has been verified and what hasn't been. Because this story is going to be a little different. Because this is both a true crime and a paranormal combined. Now, see, I had thought about making this a 2-part episode. However, for me, I want to get it all done in one episode because this is just a good combination, right? It's a very intriguing true crime story as well as a paranormal story. So what we're going to do first is we're going to view the true crime part and then we'll move into the paranormal. Now, 2 facts are beyond dispute. 2 people were brutally murdered. Someone committed those murders, and despite one of the most famous trials in American history, no one was ever legally held responsible. So pour yourself a drink and dim the lights, and let's travel back to the summer of 1892, where one ordinary Thursday morning became one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries. Now, to understand the murders, we first have to understand the city where they happened. In the late 19th century, Fall River, Massachusetts wasn't the quiet historical town many people today picture. It was one of the fastest growing industrial cities in New England. Textile mills lined the banks of the Yucatan River, their towering brick buildings dominating the skyline. The constant sound of machinery echoed through the city from dawn until dusk, and mills employed thousands of workers who produced cotton cloth shipped around the world. The city was booming. Immigrants from Ireland, England, Portugal, French, Canada, and other parts of Europe came looking for work. Some families found opportunity, others struggled in crowded neighborhoods, working long hours for modest wages. It was also a city where wealth was impossible to ignore. Successful mill owners built grand Victorian homes on a hill overlooking the city. Wide streets, elegant gardens, imported furnishings, and horse-drawn carriages became symbols of success. This neighborhood became simply known as the Hill. And if you had money in Fall River, this is where people expected you to live. Now, Andrew Borden definitely had enough money. By 1892, he had accumulated a fortune estimated around $300,000, the equivalent of many millions of dollars today. He owned rental properties, invested in banks, held business interests throughout the city, and served on several boards. On paper, he was one of Fall River's wealthiest citizens. But Andrew Borden had a reputation that followed everywhere. He was extraordinarily frugal. Stories circulated throughout the town that he refused to waste money on almost anything. While other wealthy families embraced modern conveniences, Andrew often delayed spending unless he believed it was absolutely necessary. The Borden home had no indoor plumbing, despite the family easily being able to afford it. Instead of living among Fall River's elite on the hill, Andrew chose to remain in an older neighborhood a lot closer to his businesses. Now, to many people, this made no sense. Why would one of the richest men in town continue to live in a modest home that lacked the comforts enjoyed by families with far less money? For Andrew, the answer was simple. Money was meant to be kept, not spent. Living with him were his wife, Abby, and his 2 adult daughters from his first marriage, Emma and Lizzie. On the surface, they looked like a respectable Victorian family. Behind closed doors, however, the relationships inside the house were far more complicated. That complicated family dynamic would become one of the central questions in the investigation. Because when detectives began searching for a motive, they didn't have to look very far beyond the walls of the Borden house itself. Okay, so Picture this, right? We have the Borden family, which consisted of a successful businessman, a respectable wife, and two unmarried daughters who were devoted to church and charity. Now, that seems like a very wholesome family, right? But appearances can be deceiving. According to court testimony, newspaper accounts from that time, and later historical research, life inside the Borden home had become increasingly strained long before the murders. Let's start with Andrew. He had married twice. His first wife, Sarah Anthony Morse Borden, died in 1863, leaving behind two young girls, Emma and Lizzie. 3 years later, Andrew married Abby Durfee Gray. Now, here's something important. Lizzie rarely referred to Abby as her mother. Instead, she usually called her Mrs. Borden. Now, this may sound like a small detail, but in the Victorian era, it spoke volumes. Refusing to call your stepmother mother wasn't necessarily unusual, but after nearly 30 years of marriage, it suggested that there was still some emotional distance between them. And Emma behaved much the same way. Neither sister appeared especially close to Abby, and historians still debate whether their relationship was simply polite or distant or openly resentful. What is well documented is that the household wasn't particularly affectionate. One of the biggest sources of tension was money. Andrew Borden had plenty of it, but according to those who knew him, he spent very little as possible. Again, people were amazed that he could easily live comfortably among the elite, but that he chose to stay in the family home on 2nd Street. Now, the house itself wasn't poor by any means, and it wasn't, like, bad, but it lacked the conveniences that many less wealthy families already enjoyed. Again, there was no indoor plumbing, there was no central heating, there was no electricity, and water had to be brought inside by hand. Bathrooms were little more than chamber pots that needed to be emptied. And for a family with Andrew's wealth, this struck many neighbors as unusual. But Andrew believed in saving in money whenever he could. That frugality didn't just shape the house, it shaped his relationships. One issue that repeatedly surfaced involved real estate. Andrew had a habit of giving property to relatives. Now, on the surface, that sounds generous. But to Emma and Lizzie, however, it felt deeply unfair. According to testimony presented during the investigation, Andrew had purchased a home for Abby's sister. Lizzie reportedly viewed this as proof that her father cared more about his wife's family than his own daughters. Eventually, Andrew attempted to smooth things over by giving Emma and Lizzie another property. But instead of ending the disagreement, it highlighted how fractured the family had become. Arguments over inheritance weren't uncommon during the 19th century, especially among wealthy families. But inside the Borden household, every property transaction seemed to reopen old wounds. And then came another unusual event. On August 3rd, 1892, the day before the murders, Andrew's brother-in-law, John Vinicum Morris, arrived unexpectedly for an overnight visit. Now, this was his first wife's brother. Even today, historians weren't entirely sure why. Some accounts suggest it was business. Others believe it involved family property. Whatever the reason, it placed one more person inside an already tense household less than 24 hours before the killings. And then there was the illness. Several members of the house became sick in the days leading up to the murders. Andrew, Abby, and even Bridget Sullivan, the family's live-in mate. Symptoms include nausea and vomiting. At the time, Andrew became convinced someone had attempted to poison the family. According to multiple contemporary newspaper accounts, he even mentioned this concern to others before the murders occurred. Today, most historians believe food poisoning was more likely the explanation. The family had eaten leftover mutton during an unusually hot New England summer, and refrigeration in 1892 was nothing like what we have today. Spoiled meat was very common, and gastrointestinal illness wasn't unusual. Still, it's difficult to ignore the timing. Just days before the two brutal murders, members of the household were mysteriously sick, and the patron believed someone was trying to kill them. Whether that suspicion was justified or not, it tells us something important about Andrew's state of mind. He already believed danger could be inside his own home. And if that wasn't enough, another strange event occurred shortly before the murders. According to testimony, Lizzie later claimed that Abby had received a note asking her to visit a sick friend on the morning of August 4th. Investigators searched extensively for that note. They never found it. No messenger was ever identified. No friend came forward. And no handwritten note was ever recovered. Whether the note actually existed or whether it was invented to explain why Abby went upstairs that morning remains one of the earliest mysteries in the case. By the evening of August 3rd, the Borden family had sat down to dinner much as they always had. No one could have known that within 24 hours, two members of that household would be dead. One woman would become the most famous murder suspect in America, and the quiet streets of Fall River would soon be flooded with reporters from across the country. The stage had been set. All that remained was one ordinary Thursday morning that would change American history forever. Alright, so that morning, Thursday, August 4th, it began much like any other summer morning in the Borden household. It was already warm, and the family was still recovering from the stomach illness that had swept through the house during the previous few days. Despite that, everyone went about their normal routines. Andrew Borden ate breakfast with his family before leaving for his morning business around 9 a.m. His brother-in-law, John, also left the house shortly afterwards, saying he had planned to visit relatives just outside the city. That left 4 people inside the home. Andrew's wife, Abby, Andrew's daughter, Lizzie, the family's maid, Bridget Sullivan, and, at least for a short time, an unknown killer. Bridget had already spent part of the morning cleaning the windows outside. She later testified that she wasn't feeling well and that the heat was becoming unbearable. After finishing outside, she went back into the house to continue her chores. Somewhere around 9 to 9:30 a.m., Abby Borden began making her way upstairs. According to Lizzie, Abby had received a message asking her to visit a sick friend. Now again, investigators never found evidence to support this, but regardless of the reason, Abby climbed the stairs towards the guest bedroom. She unfortunately never came back down. Investigators later concluded that somebody attacked Abby from behind while she was making the bed in the guest bedroom. The first blow struck on the side of her head. She fell face first onto the floor, and the attack didn't stop there. Medical examination showed that Abby suffered approximately 18 to 19 blows from a sharp-edged weapon, believed to have been a hatchet. Some wounds appeared to have been delivered after she had already collapsed. The violence was shocking. There was no signs of a prolonged struggle, suggesting that the attack happened quickly and with overwhelming force. One detail investigators found especially disturbing was the condition of blood. By the time Abby's body was discovered later that morning, the blood had already began to darken and partially coagulate. This means that she has been dead for a while, and definitely one of the clues that investigators used to conclude that she was dead before Andrew came home. After Abby's murder, the house became eerily quiet. No neighbors reported hearing screams. No one claimed to hear furniture's overturning. No one rushed from the house in panic. If somebody had just committed one of the most brutal murders Fall River had ever seen, they somehow remained inside, or left without attracting attention. Meanwhile, Andrew Borden continued with his morning errands, completely unaware of what has already happened inside his home. Around 10:30 a.m., Andrew returned. One of the most discussed moments in the entire case happened before he even entered the house. Andrew found the front door locked. He tried his key but had difficulty opening it. Bridget later testified that she went to unlock the door from the inside. As she struggled with the lock, she claimed she heard someone laughing upstairs. Not speaking, not crying, laughing. She couldn't exactly say where the sound came from, only that it seemed to come from somewhere above her. That brief statement has fascinated historians and later paranormal investigators for more than a century. When Andrew finally entered the home, nothing immediately appeared unusual. He removed his boots. He settled into the seating room to rest. Lizzie told him Abby had gone out after receiving a note from a sick friend. Andrew accepted the explanation. He had no reason to believe that his wife was laying dead only one floor above him. Bridget, exhausted from cleaning windows in the summer heat, asked if she could go lay down in her attic bedroom for a few minutes. Andrew agreed. According to Bridget's testimony, she climbed the narrow staircase to the third floor and then rested. That only left Andrew and Lizzie on the lower floors. What happened over the next several minutes has never been fully reconstructed. According to Lizzie, she went outside towards the barn to look for pieces of iron she planned to use as fishing sinkers. She claims she remained there for around 20 minutes despite the oppressive August heat. This part of her story immediately raised questions. Several witnesses later commented that the loft inside the barn would have been unbearably hot that morning, far hotter than the house itself. Some investigators doubted anyone would willingly spend that much time there in the middle of the day. Whether Lizzie actually entered the barn, stayed only briefly, or never went inside at all remains one of the most debated points in the case. At some point, after Andrew laid down in the seating room sofa, the killer struck again. Unlike Abby, Andrew appeared to have been asleep, or at least resting with his eyes closed. The first blow landed directly above his left eye. It was catastrophic. Doctors later testified the force of the attack was so severe that Andrew likely never regained consciousness. The attacker continued striking him multiple times, ultimately inflicting 10 to 11 blows. The injuries were devastating. When the attack ended, Andrew Borden's face was so badly damaged that some responding officers initially struggled to recognize him. And once again, no one reported hearing screams, no neighbors rushed in to investigate, the house remained strangely silent. A few minutes later, Lizzie called for Bridget. Her words have been reported in several different versions, but the meaning has remained the same. Come down quick, father's dead, someone came in and killed him. Bridget hurried downstairs. She found Andrew slumped on the sofa, covered in blood. The sight was horrifying. Within minutes, neighbors began arriving. One of them, Adelaide Churchill, crossed the street after hearing the commotion. When she asked where Abby was, Lizzie calmly replied that she thought Abby had gone out after receiving a note. Still believing Abby was alive somewhere in town, neighbors began searching outside. Then someone suggesting looking upstairs. Bridget climbed the staircase. As she reached the guest bedroom, she looked towards the floor. There lay Abby Borden, face down, cold, covered in blood. She had likely been dead for well over an hour. In a single moment, what had first appeared to be one shocking murder became something more terrifying. There hadn't been just one victim, there had been two. The killer had remained undetected inside the house long enough to murder both Andrew and Abby Borden, who were vanishing without anyone seeing them leave. Or the killer never left at all. By noon, word had spread throughout Fall River. Police officers, doctors, curious neighbors, and eventually newspaper reporters crowded the Borden home. Detectives quickly realized they weren't dealing with an ordinary homicide. They were standing inside one of the most perplexing crime scenes America had ever seen. And before the day was over, their attention would begin turning towards someone who had been inside the house all along. Within minutes of Andrew Borden's body being discovered, everyone apparently seemed to know about it. By early afternoon, curious onlookers lined 2nd Street trying to catch a glimpse of the home where one of the most respected businessmen had been murdered. The first people to walk through the door were not forensic specialists. They were local police officers. In 1892, crime scene investigators and investigations looked nothing like they do today. There was no latex gloves, there was no crime scene tape, there was no forensic photographers documenting every inch of the room before anything was touched. There was no fingerprint analysis. In fact, fingerprints would not become a standard investigative tool in the U.S. until years later. Officers walked through rooms, neighbors entered and exited the house, and doctors examined the victims where they lay. By modern standards, the crime scene would have been considered heavily contaminated almost immediately. But for that time, investigators believed they were doing exactly what was necessary. One of the first physicians to arrive was Dr. C. Barry Borden, the Borden family's longtime doctor and neighbor. He had known the family personally for years. After examining Andrew's body, Dr. Bowen immediately recognized that the wounds could not have been caused by an accidental fall or a single blow. The injuries were consistent with repeated strikes from a sharp, heavy instrument. When Abby's body was discovered upstairs, the scale of the tragedy became even clearer. 2 murders, 1 house, no obvious suspect seen entering or leaving. As investigators searched room by room, one question kept surfacing. Where was the murder weapon? Based on the shape of the wound, medical examiners believed the killer had most likely used a hatchet or a similar hand tool. The weapon needed a sharp, cutting edge capable of splitting bone, but it also had to be compact enough to swing repeatedly inside a home. Police searched closets, bedrooms, storage spaces, the cellar, and outbuildings. Eventually, they found several hatchets and axe heads in the basement. One in particular caught their attention. Its wooden handle appeared to have been broken off, leaving only the metal edge. At first glance, it seemed suspicious. How could someone have removed the handle to make the weapon harder to identify? Could this have been the murder weapon? Unfortunately for investigators, they couldn't answer those questions for certain. Modern detectives may have examined the microscopic traces for tissues, blood, protein, DNA, or latent fingerprints. But in 1892, none of those techniques existed. Investigators cleaned the blade, examined it visually, and then debated whether it matched the injuries. There was no scientific test capable of proving it had, or that it hadn't been used in the murders. To this day, historians still disagree about whether that hatchet head had anything to do with the crime. As police continued searching the house, they noticed something else. There was remarkably little blood on Lizzie Borden. Now let's think about that for a second. Whoever attacked Abby had swung a weapon nearly 20 times. Whoever attacked Andrew struck him roughly 11 more times. Those are intensely violent attacks carried out at close range. Investigators expected the killer to have been covered in blood, but yet witnesses described Lizzie as calm and neatly dressed. She wasn't soaked in blood. She didn't appear frantic. She had no obvious injuries suggesting a struggle. That observation would become one of the strongest arguments made by her supporters. If she committed the murders, where were the bloody clothes? The prosecution would eventually suggest that Lizzie had changed clothes after the attacks. The defense argued there was no proof she ever did. Then another piece of the puzzle emerged. Several days after the murder, a neighbor reported seeing Lizzie burn one of her dresses in the kitchen stove. According to testimony, Lizzie explained that the dress had been ruined by paint. Her explanation wasn't impossible. Victorian women often wore older clothing while doing housework or household work, and repainting furniture and household items wasn't unusual. But investigators couldn't ignore the timing. The murders had only occurred a few days earlier. If the killer had changed clothes after the attacks, destroying those clothes would eliminate one of the most important pieces of evidence. The burned dress immediately became one of the most controversial moments in the investigation. Was it simply an old garment stained with paint, exactly as Lizzie claimed? Or had one of the most important pieces of evidence disappeared forever in the kitchen stove? Even today, historians remain divided. And then there was that mysterious note. Lizzie continued telling investigators that Abby had gone upstairs because she'd received a message asking her to visit a sick friend. Police searched the house, they questioned neighbors, they tried to identify who supposedly delivered the message. Nothing. No note, no messenger, no sick friend waiting for Abby, no evidence that message ever existed. Some investigators concluded Lizzie had invented the story to explain why Abby was upstairs alone. Others argued that if a handwritten note had existed, it could have possibly been misplaced or discarded during the confusion after the murders. The truth has never been established. As detectives interviewed witnesses, another challenge quickly emerged. Lizzie's own statements weren't entirely consistent. Over the course of multiple interviews, small details changed. How long she had been in the barn, exactly where had she been, whether or not she heard certain noises, what she was doing, and more importantly, we have to remember trauma can affect memory. People who experience shocking events often remember details differently each time they're asked. But investigators cannot ignore these inconsistencies, especially because Lizzie had been one of only a handful of people inside that home that day. By the end of the first day, police had no eyewitnesses, no confession, no proven murder weapon, no physical evidence directly connecting any one person to the killings. But one fact stood out above all the others. Whoever committed these murders simply knew the house. They knew the family's routines. They struck exactly when the moments that each victim was isolated, and then they vanished without anyone seeing them leave. To detectives, the possibility narrowed the list of suspects dramatically. Before long, their attentions focused on one person who had been present for nearly every important moment that evening, or that morning, Lizzie Borden. Now, by the time that Lizzie Borden's case reached trial in June of 1893, it had already become one of the biggest news stories in America. Reporters traveled from across the country to Fall River and New Bedford. Every new development filled newspaper columns, artists sketched courtroom scenes because cameras were not allowed inside. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse hours before proceedings began, hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman everybody was talking about. Some people were convinced she was guilty. Others believed she never should have been arrested. The courtroom wasn't just deciding Lizzie's fate. It became a national debate about justice itself. The prosecution faced an enormous challenge from the very beginning. They believed Lizzie had committed the murders. They had no eyewitnesses, no confession, and no physical evidence directly placed directly placed the murder weapon in her hands. Instead, they built a case based entirely on circumstantial evidence. Now, I want to pause here for a moment because circumstantial evidence often gets misunderstood. Contrary to what TV shows sometimes suggest, circumstantial evidence isn't weak evidence. In many modern murder cases, people are convicted on circumstantial evidence alone. What matters is whether all the pieces fit together so convincingly that they leave little room for another explanation. The prosecution argued that Lizzie had both the opportunity and the motive. She was inside the house during both murders. There are no reliable reports of strangers entering or leaving, and the family had ongoing tensions over money and property. Investigators also believe she lied about Abby receiving a mysterious note. And then they pointed to the dress she had burned just days after the murder as behavior that deserved serious scrutiny. To the prosecution, these weren't isolated facts. They were pieces of a larger puzzle. But the defense approached the case from a completely different direction. Led by attorney Andrew V. Jenkins, along with former Massachusetts Governor George D. Robinson and attorney Melvin O. Adams, they focused on one central idea. The prosecution couldn't prove that Lizzie committed the murders. Again and again, they reminded the jury that suspicion, even strong suspicion, isn't proof beyond a reasonable doubt. They questioned the handling of the investigation. They emphasized that no blood had been found on Lizzie when witnesses first saw her. They argued that no one had definitively identified the basement hatchet as the murder weapon. And they pointed out that investigators never established exactly how the killer left the house or whether the killer had remained inside. One of the biggest moments came when the court addressed statements Lizzie had made during the investigation. Immediately after the murders, Dr. Seabury Bowen had given Lizzie morphine to calm her nerves. At the time, this wasn't considered unusual. Physicians often used morphine as both a painkiller and a sedative. However, the prosecutors wanted to introduce statements Lizzie made while she was under the effects of that medication. The defense objected and judges agreed. Those statements were ruled inadmissible, meaning the jury never heard many of the inconsistencies investigators believed were important. That decision significantly weakened the prosecution's case. Another major issue involved evidence suggesting Lizzie had attempted to purchase a very poisonous form of cyanide from a local drugstore shortly before the murders. The prosecution believed this demonstrated planning. The judge had ruled there was not enough reliable evidence connecting that alleged purchase to the murders, so the jury never heard it. And see, if you're using cyanide, that could make some people sick. Just saying. As days passed, witnesses testified about everything from the household relationships to the condition of the crime scene. Doctors described the horrifying injuries suffered by Andrew and Abby. Police officers explained their investigations. Neighbors recounted what they had seen, and just as importantly, what they hadn't. Throughout it all, Lizzie remained composed. Newspaper reporters described her as calm, neatly dressed, and remarkably controlled. For many people of the public, that composure suggested innocence. Others interpreted it very differently. And then there was the question Victorian America couldn't seem to escape. Could a respectable woman really commit a crime this violent? Now today, that question might sound odd. But in 1893, gender expectations were very different. Women were widely viewed as naturally gentle, nurturing, morally superior, and emotionally incapable of committing acts of extreme violence. That belief didn't come from evidence. It came from social attitudes of the era. The defense understood this perfectly. Without ever saying it directly, they allowed the jury to consider whether someone like Lizzie Borden could fit the image of a brutal murderer. Some historians believe that cultural assumption became one of the defense's greatest advantages. After nearly 2 weeks of testimony, closing arguments were concluded. The jury retired to deliberate. Considering the complexity of the case, many expected they would be gone for days. Instead, only after an hour and a half, the jurors returned. The courtroom fell silent. The clerk asked for their decision, and they said, not guilty. Lizzie Borden had been acquitted on both murders. Legally, the case was over, but outside the courtroom, very few minds had actually changed. Some believed justice has been served, others believed a murderer had just walked free. And perhaps the strangest part of it all, despite 2 brutal killings happening in broad daylight, no one else was ever charged. There was no second trial, there was no alternative suspect brought before a jury. The murders of Andrew and Abby Borden officially remained unsolved. Even more than a century later, they're still unsolved. Now, an acquittal doesn't end a mystery. In many ways, it begins one. Because once the courtroom doors closed, many people were free to question the legal system, and it could no longer answer if Lizzie Borden didn't do it, who did? Now, that's probably one of the reasons that the Lizzie Borden case has survived for more than a century, is because no theory answers every question. Every explanation solves one mystery while creating another. Even today, historians, criminologists, and true crime researchers continue debating who killed Andrew and Abby Borden. Since no one was ever convicted, every theory must be weighed against the available evidence rather than treated as an established fact. So let's look at some common explanations. Theory 1. Lizzie acted alone. This remains the most widely accepted theory among many modern historians. The reasoning is straightforward. Lizzie was inside the house when both murders occurred. There was no confirmed evidence that a stranger entered or exited the home. She gave investigators several conflicting statements about her movements that morning. The story about Abby receiving a note from a sick friend was never verified. And then there was the dress that witnesses said Lizzie had burned a few days after the murders. Although she claimed it had been stained with paint, investigators believed it could have been an intent to destroy evidence. Supporters of this theory also point at the timing of the attacks. The killer struck Abby while Andrew was away from the house. Later, Andrew was attacked when he returned home and while Bridget was resting upstairs. Whoever committed the murders appeared to know exactly when each victim would be alone. This suggests someone was familiar with the household daily routine. However, this theory also has weaknesses. No one ever found blood or ever found clothing covered in blood. No witnesses ever saw Lizzie carrying a weapon. No murder weapon had conclusively been identified. And the biggest question is how someone could commit 2 extraordinarily violent murders and then appear calm and relatively clean only moments later. Supporters argue she could have changed clothes and hidden the evidence. Critics point out that the investigators never proved that she did. Theory 2. Emma was involved. Some writers have suggested that Lizzie didn't act alone. Instead, they believed her older sister Emma may have helped plan the murders or assisted afterwards. This theory usually centers on inheritance. If both daughters believed Abby's family might receive a larger share of Andrew's estate, they may have feared losing part of their future inheritance. Supporters of this point to the sisters' close relationship. Emma defended Lizzie throughout the investigation and trial. Years later, however, Emma suddenly moved away from Lizzie, and the two rarely spoke again. No one knows exactly why. That separation has fueled decades of speculation. Did Emma learn something? Did the sisters argue over what happened, or was it simply a disagreement unrelated to the murders? There is no evidence proving Emma participated in the crime, and more importantly, she was not in the house when the murders occurred. She had been staying elsewhere, and no reliable evidence places her at the scene. Because of that, many historians view this theory as highly speculative. Theory 3: an unknown intruder. Another possibility is that someone outside the family committed the murder. At first glance, this is highly unlikely. But the house wasn't particularly isolated. Neighbors were nearby, it was broad daylight, and Andrew was a businessman. Over the years, he had handled property disputes, financial disagreements, and business transactions that may have created enemies. Could someone have entered the home intending to kill Andrew? Some supporters of this theory suggest that the killer hid inside the home until the right moment. Others believe the murderer slipped away while neighbors were focused elsewhere. The biggest challenge is the lack of evidence. No stranger was reliably seen entering or leaving. Nothing appeared to have been stolen, and the attacks themselves unusually personal, especially considering the amount of blows delivered to each victim. While an intruder can't completely be ruled out, the investigators found little evidence to support that conclusion. Now, theory 4: a business or personal revenge killing. Closely related to the intruder theory is the idea that someone with a personal grudge targeted Andrew Borden. Andrew's reputation for aggressive business practices and strict financial decisions meant that he wasn't universally admired. Could someone have decided to settle an old score? This theory explains why Andrew might have been targeted, but it produces a harder time explaining Abby's murder. If the revenge was against Andrew, why kill Abby first? Why remain inside the home long enough to attack Andrew after he returned? That timeline becomes increasingly difficult to explain. And for that reason, most historians consider this theory impossible but highly unlikely. Theory 5: family drama and an emotional breaking point. Some modern researchers focus less on money and more on the emotional atmosphere inside the Borden home. By every account, the household had become increasingly tense, relationships had were strained, and arguments over property continued. The sisters referred to Abby as Mrs. Borden instead of mother. Andrew controlled the family's finances with remarkable strictness. Living under constant emotional strain could have serious psychological effects. Some researchers believe years of resentment may have eventually reached a breaking point, and it's important to be careful here. There is no evidence proving long-term abuse occurred inside the home, although some authors have speculated that possibility. Because those claims cannot be verified through reliable historical documentation, historians generally avoid presenting them as fact. What can be said with confidence is that this was not a happy household. The relationships were complicated, money created division, and trust appeared to be limited. Whether those tensions were enough to lead to murder is something no surviving evidence can answer. More than 130 years, the truth remains frustratingly out of reach. The jury found Lizzie Borden not guilty, and under the law, she remained innocent of the murders for the rest of her life. Public opinion, however, never reached a verdict. Some people left the courthouse convinced that justice had prevailed. Again, others believed a guilty woman just escaped punishment. And if you ask 10 historians who killed Andrew and Abby, you're likely going to hear different answers. The evidence has never changed, only the people interpreting it have. Now, when the jury declared Lizzie Borden not guilty on June 20th, 1893, she walked out of the courtroom a free woman. Legally, she was cleared. But socially, that trial had changed her life forever. Although she could no longer be prosecuted for the murders, the people of Fall River never completely accepted her back into society. Wherever she went, people stared, people whispered behind her back, others openly believed she escaped justice. The acquittal may have ended the legal case, but it didn't end the public suspicion. Not long after the trial, Lizzie and her sister Emma left the house on 2nd Street. Given everything that had happened there, it was understandable why they would want a fresh start. The sisters purchased a very large Victorian home in one of Fall River's most desirable neighborhoods, the very type of neighborhood Andrew Borden had refused to move during his lifetime. Lizzie named the home Maplecroft. For many historians, that decision carries a certain irony. For years, Andrew had insisted on living modestly. Andrew had insisted on living modestly, despite his considerable wealth. Only after his death did his daughters move into the kind of elegant home they had likely wished all along. Maplecroft featured spacious rooms, modern conveniences, and a location among Fall River's wealthiest residents. It was a dramatic change from the older house on 2nd Street. Lizzie also began using a different name. Rather than introducing herself as Lizzie, she increasingly preferred being called Elizabeth. No one knows exactly why she made the change. Some historians believe it was simply a personal preference. Others have wondered if it was an attempt to distance herself from a name that had become synonymous with one of America's most infamous murder cases. Whatever the reason, the public never followed suit. To the rest of the country, she would always be Lizzie Borden. Despite her new home, she never truly escaped the attention of the press. Reporters continued to write stories about her for years. Visitors occasionally traveled to Fall River, hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman whose name had become a national sensation. Her life remained under a microscope. One of the most talked about friendships in her later years was actress Nance O'Neill. O'Neill was a successful stage performer who frequently toured the country. The two women became close, and Lizzie often entertained theatrical guests at Maplecroft. Their friendship immediately became a subject of gossip. Some newspapers hinted at a romantic relationship. Others criticized Lizzie simply for associating with people from the theater, which many in Victorian society viewed with suspicion. The truth is that no reliable historical evidence proves the nature of their relationship beyond a close friendship. Most modern historians caution against presenting such rumors as fact, noting that much of the speculation reflected the tabloid culture of the time rather than documented evidence. Then, sometime around 1905, another mystery unfolded. Emma suddenly moved out of Maplecroft, and the sisters never lived together again. Even more curious, they appeared to have very little contact with the remainder of their lives. Why? Nobody knows. Several explanations have been suggested for many years. Some believe Emma disapproved of Lizzie's growing social circle. Others thought she objected to the parties and theatrical guests visiting Maplecroft. Still, others believe the disagreement ran much deeper and may have involved secrets connected to the murders. But once again, there is no documentation proving what caused the separation. Neither sister publicly explained it. Whatever happened between them remained private. Lizzie spent the remainder of her life in Fall River. She donated to local charities, cared for animals, and maintained her home, but she never married or had any children. Although legally innocent, she lived with a reputation that never truly faded. And on June 1st, 1927, Lizzie Borden died of pneumonia at the age of 66. In an unusual twist of fate, Emma died just 9 days later on June 10th, 1927. The sisters were buried in the Borden family plot at Oak Grove Cemetery along with their father and their stepmother, Abby. Even in death, the questions surrounding the family remained unanswered. The mysteries were never solved, and no one was ever charged. And the house on 2nd Street, where everything happened on that August morning in 1892, remains standing exactly as it always had. Now, as the decades passed, people became less interested in the trial itself and more interested in the house where the murders occurred. Visitors arrived hoping to stand in the very room where Andrew and Abby lost their lives, and before long, stories began circulating that perhaps the house had never been truly emptied of its past. Now, we've covered the true crime section, and now we're heading into the paranormal side. Are y'all ready? Okay. For decades after the murders, the house on 92 2nd Street remained a private residence. Families lived there, children played in the yard, meals were cooked in the very same kitchen where investigators went searching for evidence. Life, at least it seemed on the surface, continued. Eventually, however, the home's connection to one of America's most famous unsolved murder cases made it impossible to ignore. Interest in the Borden murders never disappeared, and people began traveling to Fall River simply to see the house for themselves. In the 1990s, the property was transformed into a museum and later a bed and breakfast. Rather than trying to erase its history, the owners chose to preserve it. Many of the rooms were restored to resemble what they looked like in 1892, using period furniture and historical records to recreate the atmosphere as accurately as possible. Today, visitors can tour the home during the day and even spend the night. But not everyone who visits reports unusual experiences. In fact, many people leave saying they simply toured a very important historical site. But there are those who tell a different story. Over the years, guests, employees, tour guides, and paranormal investigators have described experiences they cannot easily explain. One of the most common reports involves footsteps. Visitors have described hearing someone walking slowly across the 2nd floor long after everyone else has seemed to go to bed. Footsteps often described as deliberate, moving from one room to the other before stopping. When people investigate, they frequently find an empty hallway. Another commonly reported experience involves doors. Guests have claimed that bedroom doors slowly open or close on their own. Others report hearing doorknobs rattle during the night, only to discover no one was standing on the outside. As any historical building, skeptics point out that the old houses naturally expand and contract with changes in temperature and humidity. So the floors will settle, wood shifts, and doors can move if they're not perfectly level. Whether those explanations account for every report is something each visitor has to decide. Another recurring claim is the feeling of being watched. Many visitors have described an overwhelming sensation that someone is standing nearby, particularly in the guest bedroom where Abby Borden was killed. Some have reported sudden chills in specific areas of the room, even when the rest of the house feels warm. Others have experienced an uneasy feeling that disappears the moment they leave the space. These experiences are entirely subjective. They cannot be measured or verified, but they appear frequently enough in guest accounts that they are often mentioned during tours. Perhaps the most emotional, powerful reports involve apparitions. Several visitors have claimed to see a woman in Victorian clothing standing near the staircase or looking through an upstairs doorway. Descriptions vary. There is no consistent appearance that everyone reports. Some believe the figure resembles Abby Borden. Others believe it simply might be the mind filling in details while visiting a place with a tragic history. Then there's the reports involving Andrew. Guests have described seeing an outline of a man sitting in the parlor before the figure suddenly disappears. Again, these are personal experiences rather than documented facts, and no photograph or video has consistently captured this can capture an apparition. So, paranormal investigators have also spent countless hours inside the house. Many have concluded, or many have conducted, not concluded, many have conducted overnight investigations, including audio recorders, in hopes of catching electronic voice phenomenon, or EVPs. These sounds or voices that investigators believe may not have been audible at the time of recording, but can be noticeable during playback. Some recordings are said to contain faint whispers, single words, or unexplained sounds. Supporters of paranormal investigation believe that these recordings may present attempts at communication. Skeptics argue they are better explained by background noise, audio interference, or a psychological phenomenon as, um, I don't know what that word, audio, I don't know what that is. I wrote it, but I can't remember if I looked up the pronunciation of it. Basically, this phenomena is where the human brain naturally tries to find recognizable words or patterns in random sounds. And that's one of those things, like, so this is one of those things of, like, if you ever listen to a video and it could go either way. And so it depends on, kind of like if the words you see on your screen, like if you focus on those words, you'll hear that in the audio. See what I'm saying? Neither explanation has been universally accepted, which is why EVP recordings remain controversial within both the scientific and paranormal communities. One particularly interesting aspect of the house is the reports that don't focus on Abby or Andrew exclusively. Some visitors claim to hear the laughter of a young woman. Now remember, back during the actual investigation, Bridget did mention hearing someone laughing above her. These accounts are often during quiet conversations that stops. Others describe hearing quiet conversations that stop the moment someone enters the room. There are also accounts of unseen hands brushing against guests, beds shaking gently during the night, and lights behaving strangely. With every haunting we discuss on Curiosity After Dark, it's important to separate reported experiences from established facts. There is no scientific evidence proving that the Lizzie Borden house is haunted. At the same time, there are decades of consistent reports from people who have no connection to one another and who describe remarkably similar experiences. Whether these experiences are caused by lingering spirits, the emotional weight of the house's history, emotional factors, or the power of expectation is something each visitor must decide for themselves. Regardless of whether someone stands on the paranormal, the house remains a place where history feels remarkably close. Walking through its rooms and climbing the same staircase and standing in the spaces where Andrew and Abby Borden spent their final moments is enough to leave a lasting impression, even without a ghost story. And as we've seen tonight, the story of Lizzie Borden isn't just about murder. It's about what happens when history refuses to give us an answer. We know that on the morning of August 4th, 1892, Andrew and Abby Borden were brutally murdered inside their own home. We know that Lizzie Borden was arrested, stood trial, and was found not guilty by a jury of her peers. We also know that no one else was ever charged. Those are the facts. Everything else exists somewhere between evidence, interpretation, and speculation. That's one of the reasons this case remains alive for more than 130 years. Unlike many famous crimes, there was no dramatic confession, there was no hidden diary discovered decades later, and there was no piece of forensic evidence that finally solved the mystery. Every generation has examined the same witness testimony, the same photographs, the same trial transcripts, and the same physical evidence, yet people continue reaching different conclusions. Some believe Lizzie Borden was a woman who escaped justice. Others believe she became a victim of public suspicion simply because she happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. And some believe the truth disappeared with the people who were inside that house that August morning. The Borden home has become more than a crime scene. It's become a piece of American history. Whether you visit because you're fascinated by true crime, interested in Victorian history, or simply curious about the reports of paranormal activity, you're stepping into a place where no one unanswered question you're stepping into a place where one unanswered question has echoed through generations. Perhaps that's why so many people continue returning. It's not necessarily to find ghosts, but to stand in one of the rooms where one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries unfolded and ask themselves the same question people have been asking since 1892. What really happened inside that house? Thank you for joining me tonight on Curiosity After Dark. I hope you enjoyed this journey into one of America's enduring mysteries. If you have thoughts about this case, I would love to hear them. But remember, keep the discussion respectful. We're talking about real people whose lives were forever changed by an event that remains unsolved. So until next Thursday, stay curious and keep asking the question. And remember, sometimes the most unsettling stories aren't the ones with monsters. They're ones where the truth is still waiting to be found. Alright, guys, that is it for me. I'm gonna go be a heathen and play some Marvel Rivals. Thank y'all for joining me. Just to let y'all know, next week should be. I have a schedule. I made a schedule, guys. Next week on the 23rd, we're going to talk about the Roanoke colony. I actually recently heard a podcast about this, and I learned a lot of stuff. Like I'd heard about this story, and I'm excited to get into it. Also, for July 30th, it is viewer's choice or wild card. So, if you are in my Discord, let me know which story you would like to hear. And we will get into it. If nothing else, we will do a return to the Haunted Mansion, and I will give the Haunted Mansion the better story than what I did the first time around. I was still finding my way on my very first episode, and now I feel like I've gotten down. So I might do a return, but if there's a certain case or paranormal activity or a cryptid or anything like that that you would like me to discuss, shoot me a message. I love it. And Aylin likes to say hi. Want to say hi? You don't want to say hi to everybody else? You just want to say hi to me? Okay. Well, guys, I am going to disappear and play some Marvel Rivals, and I will see y'all next week for another episode. Bye, guys.